What if the problem had nothing to do with how often you pray, or what time of day you kneel down, or even how carefully you choose your words? What if the obstacle were hidden inside the words themselves? What if, without ever realizing it, you had spent years repeating the very phrases that stop your prayers from crossing the threshold and reaching heaven? Saint Teresa of Jesus spent decades learning what it truly means to pray, and what she discovered left her speechless for days, because she came to understand that it is not the voice God hears first. It is what those words carry within them. And there are 7 words that carry something capable of blocking everything else. This has nothing to do with a lack of faith, nor with a lack of devotion. The people who repeat these words are, more often than not, the most faithful. The ones who never miss Mass, who pray the Rosary every single evening without skipping a single mystery, who are always the first to arrive and the last to leave. And yet something doesn't quite get through. Something stalls halfway. Saint Teresa of Jesus knew that experience from the inside before she could understand it from the outside. And what she lived through during that time of spiritual darkness was precisely what allowed her to leave a warning that very few have known how to read between the lines of her writings. If you want your prayers to reach heaven, write in the comments right now, "Lord, teach me to pray." Those words, written today, are the very first step toward letting what you are about to hear bring about something real in your prayer life. And if you want to keep receiving what Saint Teresa of Jesus left written for times like ours, subscribe now and tap the bell. There are people who have been praying faithfully every single day for 20, 30, 40 years. They rise before dawn, light a candle, and open a well-worn prayer book, its pages softened from years of being turned with careful, loving hands. They pray the Rosary, the Chaplet, the litanies. They know by heart every word of the Our Father, every verse of Psalm 51, every petition of the prayer to their patron saint. And yet, in some deep, quiet corner of the heart, that place where you cannot lie to yourself no matter how much you might want to, there lives a question that simply will not go away. Why does it feel like nothing is getting through? This is not a beginner's question. It is the question of those who pray the most, of those who love God the most. And it is precisely because of that love that it cuts so deeply, because it has no easy answer, and because admitting it out loud can feel almost like a betrayal of the faith they have tended with such care. Saint Teresa of Jesus knew that question from the inside, not as an outside observer, not as a teacher speaking from a safe distance, but as a soul who spent entire years praying without knowing whether any of it was reaching anywhere at all. In the book of her life, recalling those years of her early spiritual life at the convent of the Incarnation, she wrote with a raw honesty that still moves us today, that there were stretches of time when picking up her prayer book cost her more effort than any bodily penance, because her words felt like stones she was throwing upward, only to have them fall back on her without ever touching heaven. A saint wrote that, a doctor of the Church, one of the souls most deeply united to God in the entire history of Christianity. And she wrote it so that you would know that what you feel does not make you less of a believer. It makes you honest. It makes you human. It makes you precisely the kind of soul God waits for with the most patience. But Saint Teresa of Jesus did not stop at the diagnosis. She kept searching. And what she found, after years of prayer, spiritual direction, tears, and moments of profound consolation, was something that changed forever the way she understood the relationship between words and true prayer. In the interior castle, the work many consider the summit of her mystical thought, Saint Teresa of Jesus describes the soul as a crystal castle with many rooms. God dwells in the innermost chamber, at the very center of that castle. And prayer is the path the soul travels from the outer gates all the way to that luminous center where everything is transformed. But that path, Saint Teresa of Jesus writes, is not walked with the feet, it is walked with the interior disposition, with what the soul is carrying inside when it pronounces each word. And here is the heart of everything you need to understand today. The words of prayer are not neutral. They are not mere sounds that travel upward and arrive or do not arrive, depending purely on God's will. Words carry within themselves a weight, an intention, a disposition of the soul that speaks them. And that disposition can either open the path toward the center of the castle or quietly close it off without the soul ever noticing. Saint Teresa of Jesus does not speak of this in abstract terms. She speaks of it as someone who learned it through lived experience, who spent decades observing hundreds of souls under her spiritual direction, and who identified patterns that repeated themselves again and again in people who prayed a great deal but made little progress in the interior life. What she identified was not a lack of willpower, not a lack of love for God. It was something far more subtle and far harder to see from the inside. It was language. The specific words those souls used without thinking, words they had learned from their mothers and grandmothers, words they had repeated since childhood without ever stopping to ask what those words were really carrying. Because there are words that truly pray, and there are words that even when spoken on bended knee with closed eyes and an open heart, carry within them a weight that directly contradicts what the soul believes it is asking for. They carry doubt. They carry fear. They carry a distrust. They carry an image of God that is not the image of the Father that Jesus revealed, but the image of a distant judge who needs to be convinced, negotiated with, and softened by the right combination of words. And while that image lives inside the words, the prayer cannot reach where it needs to go, not because God is not listening, but because the soul has not yet understood that it is speaking to someone who already loves it without conditions. Saint Teresa of Jesus understood this, and so, in the way of perfection, she devoted entire chapters to teaching her sisters not just what to say when they pray, but from where to say it, from what interior place, with what disposition of the soul. Because prayer, she wrote, is not an exercise of the mouth, it is an exercise of the heart. And the heart, before a single word is spoken, has already told God everything it truly believes. On that night, when Saint Teresa of Jesus first understood that her own words of prayer were carrying something she had not placed there consciously, something she had inherited without knowing it, she spent hours in silence in her cell, unable to write a single word. Only afterward, when the weight of that understanding had settled, did she take up her pen. And what she wrote that night has everything to do with the first of the 7 words you are about to encounter. What Saint Teresa of Jesus found written in her own prayers that night was not heresy. It was not blasphemy. It was something far harder to detect, precisely because it sounded right. It sounded humble. It sounded devout. It was exactly the kind of language any confessor would have approved without hesitation. The kind of phrase taught to children as a sign of proper dispositions before God. And yet it carried within it a small but deep crack that prevented the prayer from ever completing itself. A crack invisible to the naked eye because it hides behind words that appear to be the very opposite of what they are. The first word that blocks prayer is not a profane word, nor a word of open and declared doubt. It is a word that millions of devout Catholics speak every day, convinced that they are simply being humble before God. It is the word, perhaps. It does not always appear on its own, and it does not always come with that exact name. It shows up disguised inside phrases that sound like this: Lord, if perhaps you hear me. Or, if it is your will, perhaps you could help me. Or, I don't know if I deserve to ask you this, but perhaps you could do something. The soul that speaks these words believes it is being respectful of God's greatness, honestly acknowledging its own smallness. And deep down, in a part of itself it hardly dares look at directly. It it is not certain that God actually wants to hear from her. Not in general, from her specifically, with her history, her failures, everything she knows about herself, and that she suspects God knows too, and that perhaps precisely because of all that, makes her less worthy of being heard than other souls, purer souls, more consistent souls, holier souls. Saint Teresa of Jesus lived through that very same uncertainty before she could understand it. In the book of her life, she describes with disarming honesty a long period of her life during which she approached prayer the way someone might knock on the door of a grand house without being at all sure anyone would answer. She prayed, yes. She persevered, yes. But she did so from a place of interior doubt that cast a shadow of uncertainty over every word. And what Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote about that season changes completely the way we must understand humility. That attitude was not true humility. It was fear dressed up as humility. Because true humility does not doubt God's love. True humility knows itself to be small and at the very same time knows itself to be loved. These are two truths that do not contradict each other. They live together in the soul without doing each other any harm. And to separate them, to choose only the smallness and release the love, is precisely what perhaps does every time it enters a prayer. Perhaps is a crack in trust. And trust, Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote in The Way of Perfection, is the very door through which grace enters. Not the doors through which God decides whether to listen, because God always listens without exception, without conditions, without regard for the history of the soul speaking, but the doors through which the soul becomes willing to receive what God already wants to give. When the soul prays with perhaps, it is sitting before that door without quite daring to open it fully. Its hand is on the handle. It can feel the warmth coming from the other side. And it cannot quite bring itself to turn the handle because a very old, very interior voice keeps telling it that perhaps this is not meant for her, that perhaps it must first be earned, that perhaps God is occupied with more important souls. That voice is not the voice of God. Saint Teresa of Jesus said so with all the directness her temperament was known for. That voice is the chief obstacle the enemy of the soul places in the way of prayer. Because if it can convince the soul that perhaps God is not listening, it has nothing more to do. The soul stops itself. The prayer empties itself. The castle remains closed without anyone having had to lock it from the outside. The second word that blocks prayer is related to the first, but it works differently and strikes at a different moment in the phrase. It is the word but, not the but of ordinary conversation, but the but that appears in prayer as an invisible break placed immediately after an act of faith. Lord, I know you can heal me, but I don't know whether you will. Not in my case. I know you love me, but perhaps not quite enough for what I'm asking. I believe in your power, but I'm not sure you care about someone like me. What this but does is more damaging than the perhaps, because it arrives after a true statement, which creates the illusion that the prayer is well formed, that the soul is being honest about its faith and also about its doubts. And in that move, in that apparent honesty, the soul undoes with one single word everything it has just built up. It is like raising a wall and knocking it down in the same gesture, like lighting a candle and blowing it out with the very same breath. Saint Teresa of Jesus observed this pattern in dozens of the souls she guided spiritually across her decades as prioress and foundress. Women of exemplary lives, of genuine and proven devotion, who in their daily prayer, without realizing what they were doing, dismantled with their but everything they had affirmed in the first half of the sentence. And what grieved Saint Teresa of Jesus most was not the but itself. It was what that but revealed about the interior image of God those souls were carrying without knowing it. Because behind the but, there was no Father. There was a distant, unpredictable God whose goodwill could never be taken for granted, who might listen or might not, depending on criteria the soul could never quite work out, who loved in general, but whose particular love for her specifically remained an open question. That image of God, built up over years without anyone ever questioning it, is what lives inside the but, and it is what prevents prayer from arriving where it needs to go. Not because God rejects that prayer, but because the soul that speaks it has already rejected it before finishing the sentence. And this is what Saint Teresa of Avila understood that night in her cell, with a clarity that left her unable to write for hours, that the problem with prayer is not technical. It is not a matter of using correct or incorrect words in some formal sense. It is a matter of the interior image of God that those words are carrying without the soul's knowledge. And changing that image is the deepest and most urgent work of the spiritual life. More urgent than adding more prayers, more urgent than lengthening the rosary, more urgent than any outward penance, because when the image of God is broken, all the prayer in the world arrives incomplete. But there are still 5 words to go. And the third and fourth work, together in a way Saint Teresa of Jesus described as the most elaborate trap the soul sets for itself, because they belong to the prayer that appears from every angle to be pure surrender, while a hidden contract is being held behind the soul's back. There is a kind of prayer that looks perfect, inside and out. It has the right posture, the right words, the right length, the right feeling. The soul that prays it has been practicing for years, knows it by heart, brings a devotion no one could honestly question from outside. There are tears at times. There are genuine moments of real fervor. There is a visible, felt surrender. And yet somewhere inside that prayer, invisible as air, but just as real and just as present, there exists a structure that has nothing to do with true surrender to God. It has to do with a transaction, an agreement, a negotiation that the soul doesn't know it's proposing, because it has wrapped it so thoroughly in the language of devotion that it can no longer see it for what it is. The third word that blocks prayer is if. Not the if of filial trust, not the thy will be done, that Jesus himself spoke in the Garden of Gethsemane, sweating blood, surrendering without conditions to the Father in the darkest moment of his human life. This is the if of concealed negotiation. Lord, if you heal me, I promise I'll go to Mass every single day for a year. If you resolve this situation, I'll never ask you for anything again. If you keep my child safe, I will change. I promise, truly this time. The soul that prays this way does not do so with bad intentions, not from coldness or conscious calculation. It does so from a place of desperation so genuine, so deep, that it feels it must offer something, must put something on the table, must give God a good enough reason to move. And that impulse, so human, so understandable, so filled with real pain, nevertheless reveals an image of God that is, at its root, the image of a powerful being who still needs to be convinced. A being who has what the soul needs but will not give it without sufficient cause. One who requires a price. Who operates by the logic of exchange, of accumulated merit, of promises kept. And while that image lives within the negotiating if, prayer cannot complete itself, because it is proposing a contract where there is already a gift. Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote about this in The Way of Perfection with a clarity that leaves no room for softened interpretations. God does not negotiate, she wrote, not because he is indifferent to human suffering, but precisely because he has already given everything without asking anything in return. The sacrifice of Christ on the cross was not the first payment of a never-ending debt that the soul must keep settling with promises and negotiated penances forever. It was total, definitive, unconditional surrender, a love without a price because it has no limit. And when a soul proposes to God, if you do this, I'll do that, Without knowing it, she is refusing that gift. She is proposing a return to an economy Christ came to close down for good. She is building a marketplace in the temple where Jesus already overturned the tables. That proposal, even when it rises from a desperate and wholly sincere heart, carries within it a fundamental distrust of God's character. A distrust that says, though the soul would never put it to herself in these words, "I don't believe you love me enough to help me without getting something in return. I don't trust that your love is freely given. I have to purchase it, even if only with my promises, my sacrifices, my most generous acts of penance." The fourth word is related to the third, but works from a different angle and produces the same blocking effect by the opposite root. It is the word deserve, or its far more frequent counterpart in daily prayer, don't deserve, which in the language of ordinary devotion sounds like this: "Lord, I know I don't deserve to ask you for this, but..." The soul that prays this way genuinely believes she is being humble. What she is actually doing without realizing it is remaining a prisoner of a spiritual economy that the gospel came to abolish from its very first pages. Because in the kingdom of God, worthiness is not the currency that opens the door to grace. It never was. What opens that door is trust, love, the relationship between a child and a father who gives, not because the child has accumulated enough merit over enough years of exemplary behavior, but because that is his child, and he loves him with a love that does not depend on the child's conduct, but on the nature of the father. Jesus said it with an image so simple and so shattering that it still astonishes us that it is so hard to truly believe. If you, then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good things to those who ask him? He did not say, "To those who deserve it." He said, "To those who ask." Saint Teresa of Avila grasped that difference at a depth her writings still haven't exhausted. And what moved her most urgently to write and to teach was seeing good, generous, self-sacrificing souls completely trapped in the economy of worthiness. Souls kept standing at the outer gate of the castle, not daring to step inside because they felt they had not yet earned the right to be in the innermost room, that there was still something missing, that there was still too much in their past that disqualified them. And while they waited to accumulate enough merit to feel worthy of God's presence, life passed, and the castle stayed closed. Not because God had closed it, but because they would not open the door. Are you praying or are you negotiating? Are you speaking to a Father who already loves you? Or to a judge you must convince of your innocence before you dare ask for anything? That question has no simple answer. Because most of the time, both things are happening simultaneously, tangled together, with the soul unable to easily tell where faith ends and fear begins. But Saint Teresa of Jesus was able to tell them apart. She named them. And in naming them, she took away the power they held precisely because no one had ever seen them clearly before. There are still 3 words left, and the 5th, the one we come to now, operates on a different plane from all the others. It operates in the dimension of time. And when time enters prayer in the wrong way, it changes everything from the inside, without the soul ever noticing the exact moment the shift occurred. Time is one of the great teachers of the spiritual life. Saint Teresa of Jesus knew this better than almost anyone. She who waited years before her prayer found the form and the depth that would carry her all the way to the innermost rooms of the castle of the soul. Years of drought, years of perseverance without visible consolation, years of speaking to God in the dark without receiving anything more than silence, and continuing even so. But time can also become one of the most powerful obstacles to prayer when the soul, without realizing what it is doing, introduces it into its conversation with God, not as an act of surrender, but as a deadline. Not as an opening, but as a demand wrapped in the language of piety. The fifth word that blocks prayer is when. And like all the others, it does not always arrive with that exact name, nor does it always come alone. It appears inside phrases the soul repeats with a frequency it does not even notice, because it experiences them as legitimate expressions of its pain and its faith. Lord, when are you going to answer me? How long do I have to keep waiting? When are you going to see what I'm going through? I've been praying for months and still nothing. When? There is absolutely real pain behind each one of those questions. A pain so genuine, so legitimate, so deeply human that it would be cruel and dishonest to minimize or dismiss it. The soul that speaks those words is not being impatient out of stubbornness or a lack of faith. She is suffering. She has been carrying something heavy for a very long time. And in that prolonged suffering, in that waiting that never seems to end, when becomes the only way her cry can find its way out. But what Saint Teresa of Jesus identified was not the pain behind the when. That pain is real, and God knows it with an intimacy that surpasses all human understanding. He knew it before the soul spoke it, before the soul herself had fully understood it. What Saint Teresa of Jesus identified was the structure that when reveals when examined carefully. A structure in which the soul, without intending to, places an implicit time frame around God, an expectation of response that carries an expiration date, even if that date is never spoken aloud. And when that date passes without the answer arriving in the expected form, what arises is not only suffering, but something subtler and more harmful, a kind of quiet spiritual resentment that folds prayer back on itself and makes it increasingly difficult to return to those words with the same openness as before. In her own words, Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote in The Way of Perfection, something that has accompanied generations of souls across the centuries in times of prolonged spiritual drought, that whoever truly loves God also loves His timing, His ways, and His manner. Not only His gifts, not only His visible and consoling responses, but also His silence, His apparent delay, those dark, arid seasons in which the heavens seem entirely still, and the soul must continue praying in the darkness with nothing more to sustain it than bare faith. No feelings to lean on, no signs to confirm it, no reason to go on except the interior certainty that God is there, even when He cannot be felt. This is not passive resignation. Saint Teresa of Jesus did not preach resignation or indifference toward one's own suffering. She preached something far more demanding and far more beautiful than resignation: active trust, the working certainty that God hears at the very moment the soul speaks, that His answer already exists and is already on its way, even though it hasn't yet taken the shape or arrived on the timetable the soul imagined when it first began to ask. And that God's silence, in no circumstance, in no life, in no human story, is ever indifference. It is a silence that is working. A silence that is building within the soul something that quick answers cannot build, because it requires time, because it requires darkness, because it requires precisely that waiting that hurts so much. The soul that prays with when is measuring, without knowing it, the love of God by the speed of His responses. It is using a clock as the yardstick of providence. And that clock, once it enters prayer, gradually transforms it into something that looks more like a complaint than a conversation, more like a demand than a petition, more like an ultimatum than a surrender. And this transformation happens so gradually, so gently, that the soul never notices the exact moment it crossed the line. It only notices one day that praying costs more than it used to, that the words come out heavier, that the God it is speaking to seems more distant than a few months ago. And it doesn't understand why, because it hasn't stopped praying, because it has been faithful, because it has done everything it was supposed to do. What it cannot see is that the clock it brought into prayer has been slowly changing the temperature of its conversation with God. Saint Teresa of Avila learned this firsthand during the years she herself called in the book of her life years of drought, years in which her prayer was faithful and entirely constant, but arid. No inner consolations, no mystical experiences, no visible sign that anything was happening on the other side of her words. And it was precisely in those years, not in the years of ecstasies and visions and extraordinary graces, that the deepest, most resilient, most genuinely true part of her interior life was formed. Because in those years, she learned to pray without depending on the response. She learned to speak to God without placing conditions on time or form. She learned that the prayer that persists in silence, that does not give up when the heavens seem sealed, is the prayer that most deeply transforms the soul. Not because suffering has value in itself, but because within that suffering sustained by faith, the soul learns to love God for who He is, and not only for what He gives. Releasing the when from prayer is not something done once and then finished. It is a decision renewed each time the soul kneels again and feels that the silence has still not broken. And the way of releasing it that Saint Teresa of Jesus taught is not to suppress it by force, but to bring it honestly into the prayer itself, to name it, acknowledge it, tell God that it is there, that it comes from fear and not from faith, and ask Him to teach the soul to trust His timing. That radical honesty before God, that ability to bring to prayer the very thing that is blocking prayer, is what Saint Teresa of Jesus called the beginning of true prayer. But there are still 2 words to come, and the 6th is the most deceptive of all those we have seen so far, because it does not look like a word of fear. It looks like a word of deep faith. And it is precisely because of that appearance that it is so difficult to see from the inside. There are prayers the soul speaks fully convinced it is trusting in God, when in reality it is fleeing from Him. This is not a contradiction that is easy to see from the inside, because the voice in which those prayers are spoken sounds devout, sounds sincere, sounds exactly as a well-prayed prayer should sound. There is genuine feeling in those words. There is a real movement of the heart toward God. And yet, if one examines with care what is moving the soul in the moment those words are spoken, what lies beneath the visible devotion, what is generating those words at their very root, it is not love, but fear. Not trust, but terror at what might happen if God does not respond. Not a desire to be close to God, but an urgent need for God to function as a shield between the soul and everything that frightens it. The 6th word that blocks prayer is protect me. Not in its pure and entirely legitimate sense, which exists and is beautiful, and carries behind it the whole tradition of the Psalms of David, the piety of the Church across 20 centuries, and the tender, childlike trust of the soul that knows its own smallness before the threats of the world and takes refuge in the strength of God. That protect me, when it is born from love and from confidence in divine providence, is a perfect prayer. When the soul says, protect me, from the certainty that God is good and that His protection never fails, that word opens the heart and prepares it to receive grace. But there is another protect me that Saint Teresa of Jesus identified in her spiritual direction of souls, one that operates in an entirely different way, even though it sounds identical from the outside. It is the protect me that arises from panic. The protect me that the soul speaks not from confidence in God's love, but from terror of a world it experiences as entirely threatening, from the conviction that something terrible is about to happen, and that only God's urgent intervention can stop it. It is the protect me that is prayed in a state of permanent alarm, multiplied throughout the day like a compulsive repetition, gradually losing its character as a conversation with God and becoming instead a mechanism for managing anxiety disguised as prayer. Saint Teresa of Jesus knew that state of soul. She knew it in others, and she knew it in certain seasons of her life, in herself. And what she wrote about it in the interior castle is something worth reading slowly. That the soul living in permanent fear has the castle occupied by an interior enemy that prevents it from advancing toward the deeper rooms. Not because God has closed the path, but because fear has it constantly looking outward toward the threats of the world outside, when the life of God is at the center, in the interior, in that deepest room, reached not by keeping one's gaze fixed on danger, but by keeping. The protect me born of panic has one telling characteristic: it is never enough. The soul that prays it does not finish praying it and feel at peace. It finishes and prays it again. It prays it for herself, for her children, her grandchildren, her home, her health, her livelihood, for every real or imagined threat filling her horizon. And when that list is done, another one is waiting. Because fear is not calmed by more protection being asked for. Fear is calmed by trust received. And trust does not come from multiplying requests for protection. It comes from a genuine encounter with a love of God greater than any threat. Saint Teresa of Avila drew a precise distinction between the soul that asks for protection from trust and the soul that asks from fear. The first prays and rests. The second prays and remains just as frightened as before, or more so, because the prayer has changed nothing within her. And that difference, that inability of prayer to produce peace in the soul that prays it, is a clear signal that something at the root of that prayer is not rightly oriented. What Saint Teresa of Jesus proposed was not to stop asking God for protection. The petition for protection is legitimate, necessary, a fundamental part of the life of faith. What she proposed was to change the place from which that petition rises, to move it from fear to love, from panic to trust, from the need to control what might happen to the surrender of what might happen into the hands of a God who is good and who does not abandon his children. And that inner shift, which sounds small when described this way, completely transforms the prayer, because the same word, protect me, spoken from love and from fear, carries within it entirely different things. And God, who does not listen to lips but to the heart, receives in one case a surrender, and in the other a demand for control that the soul cannot satisfy on its own and cannot ask God to satisfy in the way it imagines. The peace that Saint Teresa of Jesus described as the fruit of true prayer is not the peace of someone who has eliminated all danger from their life. It is the peace of someone who has placed all danger in the hands of God and returned to the interior of the castle. The peace of someone who knows there may be a storm outside, and yet within there is a center the storm cannot touch. That center is the presence of God, and toward that center there is only one way to walk, by releasing the fear, not by multiplying the petitions that fear generates. But there is still one word left, the seventh, and Saint Teresa of Jesus called it, in the writings her spiritual directors preserved most carefully, the most widespread of all, the one she found in nearly every soul she guided, the one that does the most damage precisely because it appears the most holy of the seven. And it is the word that changes everything that has come before, because without understanding it, none of the other six can be fully released. There is a word the devout soul speaks more frequently than any other, a word learned in childhood, heard on the lips of mothers and grandmothers, found in books of spirituality and in Sunday homilies, repeated thousands of times without question, because it always seemed to be exactly what a humble and sincere person should say before God. It is a word that sounds like holiness, that sounds like the self being set aside, that sounds like the kind of spiritual attitude the saints have taught for centuries. And yet, when examined from the inside, from the place where it actually originates in the soul that speaks it, it often reveals something entirely different from what it appears to be. It reveals a wound, a deep and silent conviction that the soul has carried for so long that it can no longer tell it apart from the truth. The seventh word that blocks prayer is unworthy, or its equally common variations. I'm not worthy. I'm too much of a sinner. Someone like me can't ask for this. After everything I've done, I have no right to be here. The soul that speaks these words holds a conviction, often decades old, that there is an essential distance between herself and God, that her own sin, her own history, her own spiritual inadequacy has created, and which no prayer can fully bridge. She can pray, yes. She can go to Mass, yes. She can receive the sacraments, yes. But deep down, in the place where unspoken truths are kept, she does not quite believe that God actually wants her near, that He tolerates her perhaps, that He forgives her if she is sorry enough, but that He desires her, that He seeks her out, that He loves her with the same intensity and the same urgency with which He loves the purest and holiest souls. That feels like far too much. That feels like more than her history gives her any right to expect. Saint Teresa of Jesus knew that conviction from within, and with an honesty that few saints have matched. In the book of her life, speaking of the years when the weight of her own youthful infidelities kept her at arm's length from deep prayer, she wrote something that has consoled generations of souls who recognize themselves in that same trap, that the greatest deception the enemy of the soul can work in a devout person is not to make her sin. It is to make her believe that her sins are greater than the love of God, to make her believe that unworthiness is an objective reality that God Himself recognizes, and that therefore changes the way He treats her and the amount of love she can receive. That Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote with the full force of her temperament is a lie, not an opinion, not a debatable perspective, a lie. Because the love of God is not calibrated according to the worthiness of the soul receiving it. It does not work that way. It cannot work that way without ceasing to be the love that Jesus revealed. The love Jesus revealed in the Gospels is not a love distributed proportionally according to accumulated merit. It is a love that seeks out precisely what is lost, that runs toward what is far away, that sits at table with those the world considers unworthy. And that doesn't require the soul to reach some minimum level of worthiness before offering its presence. The prodigal son did not recover his dignity before his father ran toward him. The father ran while his son was still far off, still dirty, still reeking of the pigsty where he had been living. And what the father saw in that moment was not his son's unworthiness. He simply saw his son, only his son, and that was enough for him to run. Saint Teresa of Avila returned again and again to that image from the Gospel in her conversations with her sisters, because she knew that no theological description could do what that image does. Show us the God who runs, the God who does not wait for the soul to clean itself up before drawing near, the God who sees it coming from far away and goes out to meet it without first asking how many times it has failed or how truly sorry it is. Unworthiness in prayer does not always rise from serious sin. More often it rises from something more ordinary and harder to name, the feeling of being plain, of having no visions, no revelations, none of the extraordinary graces one reads about in the lives of the saints, of being an ordinary woman with an ordinary life, a faith that sometimes falters, and a prayer that sometimes wanders. And that ordinariness, for a soul that has grown up believing God prefers the extraordinary, becomes a quiet form of unworthiness that blocks prayer just as effectively as any sin. Saint Teresa of Jesus spoke directly to that ordinary soul. She spoke from her own ordinariness, from her own distractions in prayer, her own seasons of dryness and doubt. And she said something that still needs to be said today. God is not searching for perfect souls. He is searching for honest souls. Souls that arrive at prayer with everything they are, their exhaustion, their distraction, their history, their ordinariness, their imperfect love, and who, in spite of all of it, or perhaps because of all of it, keep coming back. Because coming back, continuing to come back even when one doesn't feel worthy, even when one doesn't feel anything at all, even when the heavens seem silent, that is what Saint Teresa of Jesus called the prayer God values most. The seventh word is the deepest of the seven because it touches the very root of the relationship between the soul and God. And when it is released, when the soul learns to arrive at prayer without the weight of unworthiness as a condition of entry, something changes that cannot easily be put into words, but that the soul recognizes immediately when it experiences it. Something opens, something breathes, something that had been closed for a very long time begins at last to move. And it is precisely in that movement that Saint Teresa of Jesus placed the beginning of true prayer. Not the end, the beginning. The 7 words are not 7 separate problems. That is the first thing Saint Teresa of Jesus would want any soul to know. Any soul that has just recognized itself in one of them, or in several, or in all of them. They are 7 expressions of one and the same root. 7 branches growing from a single trunk buried deep in the soul, feeding each of those words with the same dark sap. And that trunk has a name. One Saint Teresa of Jesus used with precision in her writings, without euphemism and without cruelty. The fear of God that is not the fear of God. Because there are 2 ways of fearing God, and only one of them is holy. The fear of God that the Psalms celebrate, that the saints cultivated, that the Catechism describes as a gift of the Holy Spirit, is filial fear. The fear of a child who loves her father with such depth that the last thing she wants in all the world is to cause him pain. Who does not want to be separated from him, not out of dread of punishment, but out of love for the relationship. That kind of fear draws us closer. That kind of fear opens prayer. That kind of fear sends the soul to God with greater urgency, not less. The fear that feeds the 7 words is something else entirely. It is servile fear, the fear of a servant before an unpredictable master, the fear of the soul that cannot fully believe that God is what Jesus said he was. That respects him, yes. That fears him, yes. That prays to him, yes. But that, at the bottom of its heart, in that place where the important things are never lied about, sees him as a being whose goodwill must be earned, whose love must be merited, whose patience has a limit that the soul is always afraid it is about to reach. Saint Teresa of Jesus identified this servile fear as the deepest and most persistent obstacle in the life of prayer. Not because those who suffer it are less devout, but precisely because they are often the most devout. The ones who pray the most, fast the most, strive the hardest to fulfill everything required, because behind that relentless effort, though they do not know it, is the drive of a fear that can never quite be satisfied, that always needs one more penance, one more prayer, one more sacrifice, because it is never sufficiently certain that God's love is unconditional. In the interior castle, Saint Teresa of Jesus describes the first dwelling places, the outermost rooms of the soul's castle, as the place where those who pray but have not yet truly entered into relationship with God remain, not because they are bad people, but because they are still looking outward, toward the dangers of the world, toward their own sins, toward the conditions they believe they must fulfill before they can move deeper inward. And while they look outward, the center of the castle, where God dwells, remains a place they know of only by hearsay, never quite managing to arrive there. The pattern connecting all 7 words is exactly that. Every one of them keeps the soul looking outward, perhaps keeps it looking at its own doubt, but keeps it looking at the distance it feels between itself and God. The negotiating if keeps it looking at what it has to offer to make God act. Deserve keeps it looking at its own track record. When keeps it looking at the clock. Protect me from fear keeps it looking at threats from outside. And unworthiness keeps it looking at the image it holds of itself, which is always harsher than the image God holds of it. Not one of the 7 words looks inward, toward the center, toward that place where God waits with a patience that has no bottom and a love that has no conditions. And as long as the soul does not change the direction of its gaze, prayer can be lengthy, constant, devout, emotionally intense, and still not reach the place where true prayer occurs. The difference between the soul that prays from fear and the soul that prays from love is not always visible from the outside. Both of them kneel. Both often speak the same words. Both persevere. But on the inside, they are utterly different prayers. Prayer from fear is an effort, a task, an obligation carried out with more or less generosity depending on the day. Prayer from love is an encounter, a conversation between two who know each other and love each other, a moment in which the soul stops striving and begins to receive, because it has finally arrived at the place where receiving is possible. Saint Teresa of Jesus did not describe the passage from fear to love as a dramatic conversion that happens all at once. She described it as a path, a long path with stretches of darkness and stretches of light, with steps backward and steps forward, with days when love is felt with great clarity and days when the fear returns in force. But a path with one direction that does not change, inward, toward the center, toward that innermost room where the love of God is not a doctrine to be affirmed, but a presence to be experienced. And that path, Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote, begins at the precise moment when the soul recognizes the words of fear and decides, however effortfully, however clumsily, to bring them honestly to prayer, rather than continuing to speak them without seeing them, because the prayer that knows itself is already a different prayer, a prayer that has taken its first step toward the interior of the castle, and from that first step, everything that follows is already different. Saint Teresa of Jesus never left her warnings without a way through. She never did. Not in any of her writings, not in any of her foundations, not in any of the thousands of spiritual conversations she had across a lifetime of guiding souls. Saint Teresa of Jesus always pointed to both the wound and the remedy, because she understood, with the practical wisdom that was one of her most beloved qualities, that pointing to a wound without pointing to the cure is not compassion. It is cruelty dressed up as honesty. And she was not cruel. She was direct. There is an enormous difference between the two, and Saint Teresa of Jesus knew it perfectly. The way out of the 7 words is not a technique. It is not a new formula to replace the old formulas. It is not a list of correct words to substitute for incorrect ones. Because if the soul merely changes words without changing the place from which they arise, it will have changed its vocabulary but not its prayer. And what needs to change is not the vocabulary. It is the gaze, the interior direction from which the soul approaches God every time it opens its mouth to speak to Him. The first thing Saint Teresa of Jesus taught her sisters, and the first thing she left in writing for all the souls who would read her books long after her time, was this: before speaking a single word of prayer, pause. Not to prepare yourself, not to get into the right frame of mind, but to remember who you are about to speak to. Not a judge, not a distant Lord who needs convincing, but someone who knows you better than you know yourself, and who in this very moment, before you say a word, is already loving you. Already. Without conditions. Without waiting for the prayer. Without requiring any preparation whatsoever. Already. That already is the foundation of Teresian prayer. And it is the precise antithesis of all 7 words. Because perhaps says, I am not sure he is listening. And the already of Saint Teresa of Jesus says, he is already listening before I speak. Because but says, I believe in your power, but I doubt your interest in me. and already says his interest in me has no conditions and no exceptions. Because the negotiating if says, I will give you something so that you give me something, and already says, he has already given me everything. What I offer now is gratitude, not payment. Saint Teresa of Jesus developed in the way of perfection, a way of entering prayer that she herself practiced throughout the years of her spiritual maturity and described with the simplicity that marked everything she touched. Recollection. Not recollection as a technique of mental concentration. Recollection as an act of returning within, of withdrawing the gaze from everything outside, from the threats and the deadlines and the merits and the doubts, and directing it toward the center, toward that interior room where God lives and waits, toward the place where there is no perhaps because the presence is real, where there is no but because the love is visible, where there is no negotiation because the gift has already been given. That recollection does not require external silence, though silence helps. It does not require a particular posture, though posture can support the inner disposition. It does not require unlimited time, though time opens what can occur. It requires only one decision, the decision to look inward rather than outward, to seek God where God said he was to be found, at the center of the soul, and not in the external circumstances that the soul needs resolved before it can believe God loves it. The second thing Saint Teresa of Jesus taught, directly connected to the 7 words, is radical honesty in prayer, bringing to God exactly what is happening, without editing it, without softening it, without dressing it up in the language you think God wants to hear. If you are afraid, bring the fear. If you are doubting, bring the doubt. If you carry resentment because the heavens have been silent for months, bring the resentment. If you recognize in yourself the when or the unworthy or the negotiating if, bring those too. Tell God exactly what they are. Because God is not shocked by what he already knows. And what he already knows is exactly what is in your heart before you open your mouth. That honesty, that capacity to bring to prayer the very thing that is blocking prayer, was what Saint Teresa of Jesus called, in her own words, the first degree of true prayer. Not the highest degree, the first, the beginning. Because from that beginning, from that radical honesty before a God who already knows everything and loves equally, the soul begins to walk toward the interior of the castle, begins to move toward the center, and each step taken in that direction, however small, however halting, is already true prayer. It is already arriving. The 7 words do not disappear overnight. Saint Teresa of Jesus made no such promise, and she expected no such thing from the souls she guided. What she did promise, with the certainty that comes not from theory, but from lived experience, is that the soul that recognizes them and decides to bring them honestly to prayer, rather than continuing to speak them without seeing them, has already crossed a threshold that most souls never cross. It has already taken the step that separates the prayer of words from the prayer of the heart. And from that threshold, Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote, God does the rest. Because he does not wait for the soul to arrive perfect at the center of the castle. He goes out to meet it where it is. He takes it by the hand where it is, and he leads it with a patience that has no flaw and a love that has no shores, all the way to the place where prayer is no longer an effort but a rest, where there are no longer words that block, because the soul has learned, at last, to speak from the only place from which prayer always arrives, from the love that has no fear. If you have stayed with this all the way to the end, something in you already knew these words were meant for you. You didn't arrive here by accident. You arrived because there is in your heart a genuine desire to pray more deeply, for your words not to stall halfway. For that conversation with God, you have spent years trying to build to finally find the channel through which it can flow without obstacle. And that desire, that longing itself, is already a prayer. it is already the beginning of everything that comes next. Today, you have received something that very few people receive with this kind of clarity. The name of what has been living inside your prayer for years without you being able to see it. The perhaps of doubt dressed as humility. The but that undoes what it has just built. The if of negotiation that doesn't know the gift has already been given. The deserve that places conditions where there are none. The when that puts a clock on the love of God. The protect me of fear that reaches for control when surrender is what is called for. And the unworthiness that has spent decades closing a door God never shut. Naming them already changes them. Naming them already takes their power away. And bringing them honestly to prayer, exactly as Saint Teresa of Jesus taught, is the step that changes everything that follows. But there is something more that Saint Teresa of Jesus left written for souls like yours. There is a dimension of the spiritual life that she explored with a depth that still astonishes those who enter her writings today. And it connects directly to what you have received here. A teaching that completes this one, carries it deeper, and reveals the next step on the path toward that center of the castle, where prayer is no longer a labor, but a resting place. If what you heard today opened something in you, if it touched a place that has been closed for some time, the next video waiting for you at the end of this one was placed there for you. Don't pass it by. What comes next begins exactly where this ends. Saint Teresa of Jesus walks with you on this path, and so do I, from here, with gratitude for your faithfulness and with the certainty that the soul that seeks God with honesty will always find Him. May God bless your prayer from this day forward. May every word you speak carry within it only love, only trust, only the certainty that He is already listening. Until we meet again.